What's up, folks? How's it going? This is Waj. Hope you guys are all doing well. And today we're going to be taking a look at the new iPad Air. Now, for 2019, they completely redesigned the Air, certainly compared to the previous generation. We have a new 10.5-inch design. We're going to be specifically talking about the differences between the previous generation Air and the new Airs, but more specifically, we're going to compare it against probably one of the best tablets on the market, certainly iPads available, the 11-inch iPad Pro. So if you're interested, perhaps in the market for a new iPad and are comparing whether to pay the $300 for the Pro or to save the $300 and get the new iPad Air, this is a perfect video for you. And without any further ado, let's get right into it. Now, since the launch of the original iPad Air several years ago, Apple hasn't really refreshed the product line until this year, 2019. With the new iPad Air, we have a larger 10.5-inch display compared to the 9.7-inch display of the previous generation. With that, you do have a slightly larger footprint, but it is thinner and lighter by a decent margin, about 6.1 millimeters compared to the previous generation, 7.5 millimeters, and it's about 12 grams lighter than the previous generation Wi-Fi version as well. Now, the overall design is still quite similar to the previous generation. We still have the home button / Touch ID at the bottom. You can see that the side bezels are a lot thinner than the previous generation. And even though, like the iPad Pros, we have support for the new smart keyboards as well as the Apple Pencil, but we still have a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack for legacy compatibility if you want to use a wire headset, and you still have the Lightning connection at the bottom for charging and data transferring. Now, from a design perspective, comparing the 11-inch iPad Pro to the new Air, you can see that the iPad Pro is a little bit wider, but not as tall as the Air. That's mostly due to the fact that we still have the Touch ID home button at the bottom on the Air, and we don't have any of those physical buttons on the Pro. It's also more of a square wedge shape, and the overall thickness is also very similar. The Pro is a little bit thinner at 5.9 millimeters, and it's also slightly heavier at around 468 grams versus 456 grams on the 2019 Air. Now let's talk about the displays. Now, even though we have a half-inch larger display on the Pro, in terms of actual clarity and pixels, they're both actually very similar in terms of pixel density. They both measure about 265 ppi, but the iPad Pro still has a superior display in terms of it being slightly brighter, rated around 600 nits compared to the iPad Air's 500 nit rating, and it's also double the refresh rate, which actually makes a huge difference in real life when you are using them. You can see that there's virtually no motion blur. Anybody that used a 120 hertz gaming monitor knows the benefit of that, and that is present on this tablet versus the new Air is still rated at 60 hertz. Now, in addition to the better display, we also have a slightly better speaker configuration. We have a quad speaker configuration on the Pro versus we're using stereo speakers that more or less sound pretty much the same as the previous generation iPad Air speakers. They don't have the depth and volume that is present on the iPad Pro. So if you are watching a movie with a whole bunch of people and want something brighter and clearer in terms of sound configuration coming straight out of the tablet, definitely the Pro will outperform the Air. Now, one of the most standout features of the new generation iPad Pros is how powerful the Apple A12X Bionic processor is. It actually is very comparable to a desktop-grade PC. It's actually much faster than even the current generation MacBook Air. And the new iPad Air is using the A12 Bionic, but it's a 6-core version of the octa-core processor found in the Pro. And we still have 4 high-efficiency Tempest cores, but we only have 2 of the Vortex high-performance cores compared to the 4 performance cores on the A12X. We're using 7 core graphics versus 4 core graphics on the Air. And in terms of memory, we have 3 gigabytes of RAM on the Air versus 4 gigabytes of RAM if you get the 64 to 512 gigabyte internal storage capacity configurations. There's also a version with 6 gigabytes available on the Pro with 1 terabyte of internal storage capacity. And let's actually take a look at the benchmark results between the A12 and A12X chip. And basically, basically looking at Antutu, you're looking at about 372,000 points on the iPad Air versus over 548,000 points with the A12X. Geekbench, in terms of single core and multi-core performance, the single core performance is actually not a huge difference, and on the multi-core performance we're looking at 18,000 points on the Pro versus 11,000 points on the Air. Now, in addition to those synthetic benchmark results, I also wanted to factor in more real-world applications. So we rendered out a 5-minute 28-second iMovie project and see simply how long it took to export into a 1080p video file, and it took about 1 minute 26 seconds on the Pro versus the iPad Air. Finished that project in about 1 minute and 42 seconds. Now let's talk about the camera configuration on the new generation iPad Air. And compared to the previous generation Air, the rear-facing 8-megapixel camera isn't really any better than the previous generation, which is kind of upsetting to see. We still have 8-megapixel stills and 1080p at 30 FPS video capabilities, but the big addition definitely has to be the new 7-megapixel front-facing camera, which is a huge and massive improvement from the 1.2-megapixel camera that we had in the previous generation iPad Airs, which absolutely looks terrible compared to the new generation, which definitely has better skin tones, overall dynamic range, and is better in low light, which is really important because I think a lot of people use those front-facing cameras when they're using their iPads. Now, compared to the iPad Pro, which utilizes a single 12-megapixel camera with a maximum aperture of f1.8, if you take a look at our sample comparison, you'll see that the iPad Pro is definitely rendering out better overall details in terms of clarity, sharpness, color rendition, all the facets that make an image good. Generally, what we find is that the Air tends to over-sharpen things and lose some of the fine detail, and it definitely makes the scene look kind of unrealistic. And keep in mind, we have HDR and all the different filters completely off on both cameras. Now, video-wise, we also have a much superior camera on the Pro. It can do 4K at 60 FPS, 1080p at 120 frames per second, and 720p at 240 frames per second. Big improvement from just 1080p at 30 FPS that even the new generation Air inherently has. Now, finally, in terms of battery life, we basically have the same overall capacity, 30.2 watt hours on the Air versus 29.37 watt hours on the 11-inch iPad Pro. They both guarantee around 10 hours of real-world usage, and obviously it's going to depend upon your usage profile and what you're going to do. You can certainly wear out the battery faster on the iPad Pro. In my experience, it definitely has more performance cores, which will drain the battery life a little bit faster, and if you're cranking that brightness, you are going to drain the battery life a little bit more. So generally speaking, you might get a couple of more minutes out of the Air, but not going to be a big difference nonetheless. Now, from a price perspective, the cheapest configuration of the new generation Air starts around $499 versus you're looking at $799 for the cheapest version of the 11-inch Pro. Now, as we mentioned before, you do get quite a bit for that $300. Certainly in every facet, the Pro is a more capable tablet. And for me personally, I think it's the better overall design. Certainly looks more like the modern design language that Apple will probably employ with their new generation of iPhones and things like that, and seems to be a lot more of a step forward than compared to just kind of a simple refresh of their very popular iPad Air that has sold very well. Now, certainly from a price perspective, $300 is still a decent amount of money, and from a performance standpoint, the Air is still very, very capable, and in most cases, still using the iOS platform and as capable as the iPad Pro is. In more situations, 99% of iPad users are going to be completely satisfied with the new generation Air. Unless you're going to do a little bit of photography with it, I really don't recommend going to the Pro for, again, most of you guys that are interested in the iPads in the first place. If you have any specific questions, let me know. Definitely give us a thumbs up if you like this video. And thank you so much for watching. Check out the description for more details, and we'll see you next time. Take care.